Video games cause violence. Lavafall, I couldn't agree more. Of all the video games I've played, the amount of violence that it has caused is unbelievable. Yitzy says, no they don't lie. Okay, so video games causing violence. It's been around for a long time. I've been around for a few years. I've been, playing games and seeing this conversation come up over and over again. In fact, it is probably one of the most resurfacing of hot topics that you see come back over and over again. And there are studies showing that, video games cause violence. There are studies showing that it doesn't. There are so many studies being done. Studies are not the end result. They are not the closing of the door on the conversation. Studies are insights. Studies can be flawed. They can have biases, but they do provide us with some form of information. Now, what I would say is that I've heard, horror stories of video game violence, and I've seen stuff that's hyperbole, so to speak. And in my own personal experience, video games influence me, okay? They influence me. And it makes sense because anything that happens in this world that you interact with becomes a part of you, whether you like it or not. It becomes something that influences you. So, what we can't do in this reality is take you when you were 5 and clone you and clone the world and have 2 of you, and one plays violent video games and the other doesn't. But can't you imagine that if you spent your life consuming violent video games, the chances of you becoming violent could potentially be increased? Not saying it would or it wouldn't, but surely seeing that kind of violence is going to have an effect on you. Now, I'm not advocating by saying that the two are related in that way. My personal experience is that I used to play violent video games, FPS games and all this, and I found it really desensitized me to violence. I'd be watching horrible movies with people getting chopped off and stuff, and it didn't shake me or anything. And then I kind of became aware of this desensitization to violence and decided to stop playing these sorts of games many years ago. And now I find like I choke up at movies. I watched Schindler's List, and it was hard to not cry watching that movie. If I'd have watched that many years ago, I really imagine that I would not have felt the violence and the suffering in the same way in that movie. There is something about, for me, simulating the death of humans in a computer game that just desensitizes me to it. So yeah, again, I'm not saying that the two are linked in that way, that video games cause violence. Violence exists in society, in many places. And we all interact with different parts of society. And we all take it in different ways. For some people, it might just be the thing that takes the edge off. It might be the thing that stops them from doing something horrendous. It's very individual. It's very hard to say. But personally, I think the argument around it is just too easily condensed into this, well, do they or don't they? It all depends. It all depends. Like, some people are very easily influenced, and other people not so much. Violence causes video games, says SS5D. Violence causes video games. Yeah, it does. Okay? How many games are there based around war? Violence creates video games. Like, lots of video games are based around violent events. Pretty interesting when you think of it like that, right? So anyway, we have this topic that comes up over and over again, and it usually revolves around the idea that video games should be censored or banned. I don't believe in censorship. I believe in education. I believe in, okay, we've got this thing in the world. Obviously, by the way, there are going to be like edge cases and extreme examples of things that we all agree on should be censored or whatever. But, for where we have disagreements or whatever, like, I generally don't believe in censorship. I believe in education, teaching people about what they're seeing as opposed to just trying to hide them from it. If you try and hide people from something, you try and take it away from them, it empowers them. You want to play that game that your parents took away from you more because they took it away. It's like, whoa, what is it about this game? I've got to play it. I believe education is a better thing. Give people the tools to understand what they're interacting with. Get them to think about it. If you play Like, I'm very interested in war, okay? Historically speaking, and learning about war from a historical perspective. It's just unbelievable how grotesque war really is. But if you play violent video games about war, they kind of like, what's the word they love to use? You know, they make it look good. There's a word there and it's not coming to me. But I had a friend, you know, growing up when we used to play these video games, and he was always like, yeah, I'd be a sniper taking out the Germans from a distance and all this. And it was even used to say it'd be like, you'd be the first person to run at the sight of violence. Like, the glorification is the word. Glorification. It glorifies it, okay? So I believe that education is the antidote there. You need to actually understand the horrors of war. If you go and learn about what happened in the trenches with the gas and the shelling in World War I, it's horrible. It's nothing like a computer game. Computer game will always make you feel safe and capable, and you know, like you're the hero taking out the enemies and all this kind of stuff, right? Whereas in reality, like, war is death. There aren't victors in war. Just a lot of people that die. And then a bunch of lines in the map get redrawn at the end of it. I feel like the most of the idea of conflict is that it presents in stories, both in video games as well as movies that glorify, or I guess makes it easy to show conflict. Not 100% sure what you're saying there, but movies do a similar thing, right? Movies can glorify it. And again, like, I think you need to have honest conversations around these things, right? Like, if I'm saying that video games and movies can glorify violence, I'm not also saying therefore they should be banned. Okay? I don't believe in that. Again, it's just education. You need to understand what you're interacting with. I can watch, you know, movies. For some reason, the movie Hacksaw Ridge just came to mind, but you know, like, that one really choked me up, actually. Like, I used to watch a lot more violent movies like that when I was younger, and I watched that one when it came out a few years back, and it really choked me up. Again, just I'm more sensitized to it again because I stopped watching so much of that kind of stuff, right? But even though that's a really fascinating story, by the way, based on a true person who was a pacifist, who didn't want to shoot or hurt anyone, but wanted to partake and do their part by helping other people. And so they were like a medic that went out into the field into very dangerous situations purely just to rescue people and bring them back. Very, very noble way to uphold your own ethics in an environment like that, I think. Could games raise awareness for the atrocities of war, though? They absolutely could. And again, through education, through the lens of education, they could do that. And they would be a great tool to do it, to teach you about. I do think, though, they might be a little bit of a blunt tool because games by default are supposed to be enjoyable and fun. So you have to make your game enjoyable and fun. If you want to really educate someone on the horrors of war, you know, your game would be like this. It would be like, okay, you're shipped out in a truck, you're heading towards the front lines, all of a sudden you start hearing explosions, you're trembling with fear, the smell of death is coming out of the trenches, you know, and then it's like you make your way in, there's bodies rotting in the trenches, there's rats running around everywhere, it's disgusting, morale is low, and, you know, as you're making way over there, oh, you get hit by a bit of shrapnel, and then maybe you get sent over the front, and then you're dead in minutes. Like, in World War I, people were just, like, people in the fight were just numbers being destroyed every day. It was a war of attrition. It was constantly both sides mowing down each other and hardly gaining any territory. I would play such a game, says QWERTY. The point would be is that every time you played the game, you would get mowed down, and then maybe like 1 in 10,000 you would get a little further. But ultimately, you just end up dying. And, you know, that would educate for sure. But would it be fun? Would you play it for that long? Probably not, you know. But yeah, I think games could definitely have the power to educate, no doubt. No doubt at all. Just depends on how they're done, really, more than anything, right? Vinterist says, video games teach you how to defend yourself. Fact. I wouldn't be so sure about that, because a lot of, like I was just saying, there's not a lot of realism. You might think of it. Remember, many of those war games, you're running around just going, oh, shoot, 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 shoot. Like, yeah, it'll teach you some things about weapons and about scenarios and military lingo. There's things in it that you can pick up on and learn through, but to say defend yourself, that's kind of specific. I mean, can a video game teach you a martial arts skill? Not so sure it can, you know, because that's physical. You have to get involved. Like, you might think it teaches you guns, but you're not actually holding it. It's not physical. So it can teach you some stuff, but some of the more physical stuff I'd be a bit more skeptical about, personally. Battlefield 1 did that. You're thrown in the middle of World War I battlefield situation in which impossible to survive, and every time you die, a name appears on the screen with their date and birth and death, and then you continue as a soldier to another soldier until they die too. All right, that's an interesting way to do it. Yeah, well, I'd say then, like, you know, based on the tone of the game, did that kind of like teach you that this is awful? I mean, that's what it doesn't have to do that, right? Like, that's just kind of what I'd hope. If games are going to be educational, we've got to remember that war isn't fun and games are fun. So hopefully it can get that message across. But yeah, you know, it's weird. Like, war games don't appeal to me very much. One thing that would appeal to me a bit is the strategy of war. Where I'm watching World War II week by week and learning about how troops moved around at the front lines, I'm always very interested in concepts of supply lines and industry that fuels war, because when you first think of war, start to learn about, oh, these things happened, you know, like they teach you in school about World War I and II for good reason, because we need to know about these things, not forget them. And, you know, you just kind of think of it, all right, we send the people over there and they fight, and then, like, when you understand it a bit more, the complexity of it a bit more, you realize there's all these other layers of stuff going on. There's so many layers, like even stuff like morale is important, right? And then you have like workers to produce ammunitions, and there's supply lines and food, and there's all these economic systems that drive a war. And the sort of game I'd be interested in, I bet there's one out there, I haven't researched one, but I think I'd be interested in playing a war game where you have to manage all of that stuff. Like, that would be really interesting to see how that plays out, like managing supply lines and food and industry, because they're like big and complex things to manage that fuel the war. And it would totally suit a strategy game, right, to do something like that. I bet there's been some that have been made with that angle. It's got to have been. Right, so a few people are saying Hearts of Iron 4. Civilization 6, I think I played that and it did not have supply lines in it. Okay, let's hope I don't get addicted to some video game and stop making Minecraft videos, right?